Well, I'm tempted to start off by saying that this is impossible, to give an overview of the military history of the First World War in just under an hour. And I sort of drew my breath in a bit when Gresham College invited me to do it, but I'll try. What I can't do, of course, is begin to do justice to the essence of what the military history was all about, which was millions of individual tragedies. Quoting Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian theorist in the 19th century, war is an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. The essence of it is destruction of property and killing, maiming, capture of human beings. And these things happened on an unprecedented scale between 1914 and 1918. What I will try to do is to give a sort of framework for trying or beginning to understand why these things happened, why the war took the form and the forms that it did, and also to try to convey a bit some of the findings of the intensive research that's gone on into these topics, particularly over the last 3 decades, really, since the opening of the military archives of the main belligerent countries. The other thing I want to say is that I'm going to talk primarily about the Western Front in France and Belgium, but of course this was a global conflict, and I will try to make reference to other theatres as well, and also to say something about the war at sea, because these things all, of course, interconnected. The Western Front was not fought out in isolation from everything else. The other thing I want to say, as you'll see, and why I put this up at the start, is I'll try to divide it into 3 phases. These are essentially phases based on the experience of the Western Front, though they have some applicability, I think, to the war as a whole. They're phases of unequal length, but the first thing to look at is the relatively mobile campaigning of 1914, why the initial war plans failed. Secondly, I want to move on to the dreadful middle period of the war. This is probably the period that's most urgently, vividly remembered, the stalemate period of trench warfare, months-long attrition battles between 1915 and 1917. And then thirdly, and perhaps less well known, is the last phase of the war in 1918, when there's a partial return to a war of movement, or at least semi-movement. And that's also the year of Allied victory. So, like all stories in a way, this is a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, except that it wasn't really an end in 1918. It was a rather inconclusive, downbeat termination. And I'll try to suggest some of the reasons for that as well, why the Allied victory was undoubtedly a victory, but less complete than many people in the Allied countries and governments had hoped. So those 3 phases then, war of movement, stalemate, return to movement, and also the origins, the reasons for the Allied victory and the nature of that victory. Those are the 2 big continuous threads and themes that I'll try to follow as I work through this story. Well, you're an audience, I think, many of you are old enough to remember A.J.P. Taylor. So there he is with a characteristic quotation that the First World War had begun, imposed on the statesmen of Europe by railway timetables. The inflexibility of railway timetables. You've already had a lecture, I think, on the origins of the war, and I know this is part of a series of lectures that Gresham College are running. And one of the essential elements in understanding why the war broke out in the first place is still the role of military plans. Peacetime strategic planning was something that was relatively new in Europe. If you go back into the 19th century, at the time of the Crimean War, for example, the British and French had first decided to declare war on Russia and then thought about how they were actually going to fight the war. They didn't go into it with a pre-arranged war plan. In 1914, of course, all the powers did go into the conflict with pre-arranged war plans. And there are a couple of things I think that Taylor said were misleading. Number one, the plans were much more flexible than he supposed, and all this quotation suggests. Just to give you an indication of that, by 1914, the French were already on their 17th plan, since they'd started planning process, and the Russians were on Plan 19. In fact, they were on Plan 19 revised, and about to go on to Plan 20 in the September of 1914. And the Germans had a rolling plan. We often hear about the Schlieffen Plan, but the Germans actually revised their plan every year on an annual cycle, like a kind of modern business corporation. The other thing that we know, and this is something else that's come out of recent research, is that it's not true that most military chiefs expected the war to be over by Christmas. Maybe some of the politicians did, and certainly the politicians said so, and probably the ordinary European public expected it was going to be a matter of weeks. But most military chiefs of the General Staff, strategic planners, envisaged a conflict that would last at least 18 months, perhaps 2 years. It's true that nobody expected a war that was going to last 5 years and be as devastating as it turned out to be. So the plans are more flexible and the planners' assumptions more realistic than we used to think, but nonetheless, in the summer and autumn of 1914, all of the belligerents' plans, almost without exception, failed. And that's the first reason why the war takes the form it does, that the initial war of movement doesn't last for more than a couple of months. Now, the best place to start looking at that is the German war plan. There's been a long debate about this, and people may want to ask me about this afterwards. It's best not to refer to it as the Schlieffen Plan. If you want to call it something, you either call it the German War Plan or the Schlieffen-Moltke Plan, because Helmut von Moltke the Younger, who was the chief of the General Staff from 1905 onwards, made major changes to the plan that had been left to him by Alfred von Schlieffen, who was the German chief of strategic planning from 1890 to 1905. But you see the essence of it. The Germans envisaged that it would be a war on two fronts, and the way they would win such a war, if they could, was to move the bulk of their army. At least 2/3 of their field army would go to the west to try to defeat the French quickly, and the only way in which the Germans thought they could do that was to go through Belgium. This is why the lines on the map, as you can see, are going through the plain of Belgium to the north of the forested area and hills of the Ardennes, and avoiding what you can see marked in black, I think, towards the bottom of the map, which are the modern fortresses that the French had constructed on their border with Germany. There were fortresses in Belgium, but they had not been kept up to date, and the Germans rightly thought that those fortresses could relatively quickly be smashed by the Germans' mobile heavy artillery. So that's the essence of the German plan, which its gestation period goes back to more than 10 years before the war, but is more or less implemented in that form in 1914. While the Germans are advancing through Belgium, the French, and you can see the blue lines on the map, are attacking into Alsace-Lorraine, the territories they'd lost in 1871, and into Belgium, into the Ardennes, though they only go into Belgium after the Germans have first violated it. It's a neutrality, and the French are driven back with very heavy losses. There you see a rare picture of the German invasion of Belgium, rather remarkable, gives you a feel of what the first days of the war were like for the advancing German troops. It almost looks like a summer holiday hike, doesn't it? It wasn't going to stay like that, of course, for very long. The map here shows after the German victories in the opening battles, the so-called battles of the frontiers, in late August of 1914, the French fall back. You can see, and so does the small British expeditionary force after the Battle of Mons on the 23rd of August, which was centenary, of course, that we recently commemorated. The British and the French all falling back to the east of Paris. That line gives you an indication of the Allied retreat. But while that retreat is going on, the French commander, Joseph Joffre, is using the time that he gains by retreating to move forces by rail from the east of his line towards the centre, which means that by mid-September, or by the 9th of September, the French are in a position to counterattack the First Battle of the Marne and drive the Germans back. So, once the Germans retreat, the trench stalemate begins to form from September onwards. Why do the Germans retreat? The Germans are probably closer in September 1914 to winning the war than they were ever going to be again. So it's not surprising that this has been a controversial question. If the war was going to end quickly, the only way in which it could end would be with the Germans winning it. There was no chance of the French winning it in a couple of months, or the Russians. The only people who might have been able to do it were the Germans. Though even that, I think, was highly improbable. But the reason why the Germans actually fail are partly due to mistakes in command. Here's Helmut von Moltke the Younger, who I've mentioned already, the chief of the General Staff, so the chief primary German peacetime planner between 1906 and 1914, the man who's de facto commander of the German army once the war breaks out. You can see perhaps the haunted look in his eyes, and that gives an indication to the man's personality. This is someone who was unsure of himself, lacked confidence, wasn't sure that Germany could actually win the war, though he pressed nonetheless for Germany to start it in 1914, because he believed by 1917 the chances of winning would be even less. And during the crisis, the first few weeks of the war, he made a number of clearly mistaken decisions. One was to move 4 divisions eastwards to deal with the Russians. He didn't actually need to do that. But that weakened his right flank, the key First and Second Armies that were moving westwards through Belgium towards the Marne. He also made a decision at the Battle of the Marne itself to delegate the decision to retreat to a staff officer, Colonel Richard Hench. Remember, Moltke is back in Luxembourg, 150 miles behind the front line. He isn't aware, he isn't in touch with what's going on. So he sends a staff officer to make the decision, and the staff officer seems to have called the decision wrongly. The Germans didn't actually need to pull back, but they did. Now, what's interesting, of course, even if the Germans had not pulled back, they were neither on the verge of capturing Paris nor of forcing France to surrender. The failure of the Schlieffen-Moltke plan is partly due to mistakes, but the probability was always that it was going to fail, and there are a number of reasons for this. One is the Germans had underestimated the French. This is Joseph Joffre, the French commander. You can see perhaps the difference in character and demeanour between him and Moltke. This is someone who throughout the Marne campaign slept soundly, ate heartily, regularly interfered with his subordinates' decisions, was kept in touch with the commanders of the front because the French had a communications advantage. The French could use cables and telegraph, an intact communications system to communicate with their frontline commanders. The Germans couldn't. And Joffre was also a railway expert. Background was as a colonial soldier and an engineer, so he was accustomed to planning railway movements which were very important in 1914, moving troops from the areas of the front where they were not needed to the areas where they were. Another point to make is that unlike 1870, the Franco-Prussian War, the previous great Western European war, that had been a shambles for the French, but this time round the French army was mobilised swiftly and was almost as big as the German one. The Germans were trying to defeat the French when they had barely a numerical advantage over the French, British and Belgians combined. So the French army mobilised swiftly. Joffre kept his nerve, had a fallback plan which he implemented, and the French had invested heavily in their railway system. So the French not only had access to an intact telegraph and cable system of communications, they also commanded a dense network of railways in northeastern France, whereas the Germans, by the time of the Battle of the Marne in September 1914, the leading German units were 100 miles ahead of their railheads. And in between, they were having to move supplies and munitions by lorry, but they only had about 4,000 lorries, most of which broke down, and horses, but tens of thousands of the horses died along the roads leading to the Marne front. So the Germans lacked the fodder for them and lacked proper veterinary care. So if you look at the logistics of it, which Schlieffen had not really considered seriously, the German plan, the odds were always against it, given the preparations that the French had been making in peacetime. But there's also something more fundamental, which is going to shape the entire course of the war, and this is the 19th century revolution in firepower. Now, this is part of it, the magazine rifle. I've given an example of the French Lebel rifle, modelled, comes in the 1880s. Soon after, the Germans adopt their Mauser, the British bring in their Lee Enfield in the mid-1890s. Now, the key feature of this is a magazine, which is clipped in to the body of the stock of the barrel, just in front of the trigger. You can see it most clearly in the middle of the rifles here. These fire smokeless powder. Infantry, well-trained infantry, can fire a Lebel rifle or a magazine rifle up to 15 times a minute from a range of half a mile. It's a far more formidable weapon than the muskets that had preceded it, and they're also using smokeless powder. So when they fire it, they do not give their location away. The second thing, of course, is the machine gun, a Vickers machine gun in action in 1917 here, British troops operating it. Now, that could fire across a range of 2,500 yards, in other words, well over a mile. And it could, as it traversed to and from side to side, it could fill an arc 500 yards wide with flying lead. Now, we often think about machine guns in connection with the First World War, but actually 58%, it's estimated, or almost two-thirds of the casualties, the deaths on the Western Front, were actually due to artillery fire. Even more important than the rifle and the machine gun was the field gun, the modern field gun, the prototype being the French 75mm, brought in again in the 1890s, but rapidly copied by other European armies. The British standard field gun was the 18-pounder, for example. The Germans had a 77mm. This, with a practiced crew, could fire up to 20 rounds a minute of shrapnel shells or high explosive. The predecessor of the 75mm could fire 4 rounds a minute. It didn't need to be repositioned every time it fired. That's the key thing. It's got a hydraulic piston attached to the barrel, which absorbs the recoil of the gun, so it doesn't have to be repositioned after firing each round. So it can just fire and fire and fire. And on the Battle of the Marne, that's what the French did. They fired off hundreds of thousands of 75mm field gun shells. So this is the firepower revolution, and on balance it favours the defender over the attacker. And if we move to other fronts in 1914, we see this pattern replicated. Now, in the East, I've put up a picture of Eastern Europe. You see here the basic geography of Eastern Europe is the Russian Poland here, sticking out with Germany in the north. Here's East Prussia, and to the south, here's Austria-Hungary, Germany's main ally. Here's the Austrian province of Galicia. So the main fighting takes place between Russian Poland, East Prussia, and Galicia. Now, what's interesting in East Prussia, the Russians face much smaller forces. The Germans have only about 1/10 of their field army here. The Austro-Hungarian army is smaller than the Russian one and is sending troops also down south against Serbia, where they're quickly repelled in 2 invasion attempts in the autumn of 1914. So the Russians should have had a huge numerical advantage, but what they do is divide their army, so they attack both Austria and Germany. And then they divide it again, because in invading East Prussia, they send one army up here from the south and one army coming in here from the east. And this means that in 1914 in East Prussia, the situation is reversed from the situation in France. It's now the Germans, they're defending 8th Army, which has the advantage of interior rail lines and intact cable communications. It's the Russians advancing along sandy tracks through forests and lakes and swamps who do not have the transport advantages and also have to communicate with each other by wireless, and the Germans, of course, are able to intercept and read the unencrypted Russian wireless messages. So this shows you what happens. The German army shuttles down first to encircle the Russian Second Army down here at Tannenberg, and then goes up north and drives the Russian First Army out of East Prussia at the Battle of the Masurian Lakes. Now, once you do this, you compare the Marne on the one hand with East Prussia on the other, you begin to see how there is an almost invariable advantage in favour of the defender. One of the few exceptions to this rule is in the south, in Galicia, where here the Russians are able to defeat the Austrians and overrun a large part of Austrian territory, including the Austrian breadbasket here in Galicia. That's what that shows, if you like, is that the offensive, it's still possible to conquer territory, but only if you have a very large numerical advantage. And even in that case, once the Germans help the Austrians, then the Russian advance is halted. Now, as we come to the end of 1914, the fighting fronts are stabilising. So after the Battle of the Marne in September, the so-called Race to the Sea, which is rather a misleading name, takes place, and the Western Front forms through Picardy, Artois, and up into Western Belgium. By the beginning of November, the First Battle of Ypres being fought here, that process is essentially complete. What's important to understand is that it leaves the Germans in possession of nearly all of Belgium and about 1/20 of metropolitan France, including key industrial areas in French Lorraine, down here, and also up here around Lille and the French manufacturing area and northern coalfield. That means that to end the war on favourable terms, the Allies will need to drive the Germans out of those territories, which turns out, of course, to be forbiddingly difficult. Now, it's true that on the other hand, if you look at the global picture, by 1915, the Allies have destroyed nearly all the German warships operating outside the North Sea, have severed the Germans' and Central Powers' trade links with the outside world, and the Allies are in a position to bring in resources and manpower from all over the globe. Just to give one example of how soon that applies, the British have a 50-mile sector here in the north, in Belgium and northern France, in the winter of 1914-15. 1/3 of that is held in that winter by troops from India, who have already been brought to fight in the West. 80,000 Canadians are training to move to the front, have arrived already from Canada in the British Isles. So in the long term, resources may give the Allies the longer term advantage. The question is whether that will suffice, given that the Germans control these key areas of territory and that the German army is essentially a more effective, efficient army, consistently through almost the entire war, than any of the armies that oppose it. Germans have the advantage of effectiveness and efficiency against Allied superiority in numbers and resources. So we move on now from the War of Movement to the period of stalemate. What I need to underline here is that by the end of 1914, both sides have already suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. It's actually during the initial phase of open warfare that the daily casualties are greatest. Just to give you one example, the French army on the 23rd of August, so right at the start of the war, the 23rd of August, the French army suffers 27,000 dead in one day. So this shows you the impact of the new weapons on troops exposed in the open. It's unsurprising that their immediate reaction, as soon as possible, in response to bursts of shrapnel over their heads in the open, is to react by digging. And trenches, whatever their evil reputation, which may well be deserved, they saved lives. They provided some protection. Men felt safer in them. This is very clear if you read the memoirs of the period. Maybe people are writing in their letters and memoirs to reassure their families, but a theme that keeps coming across is how once they're in trenches, and particularly with their head below the parapet, they feel themselves more or less protected against anything other than a shell directly landing on top of them. So one of the outstanding new features of the war in 1915 is, of course, this: 475 miles of opposing trench systems extending from the North Sea to Switzerland. Now, there are some precedents in previous wars, such as the earthworks, trench fortifications, and barbed wire and searchlights and machine guns around Port Arthur in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, but there's been nothing previously remotely on this scale. It amazed people at the time, and in some ways it's amazed people ever since. British troops in the front line used to fantasize about walking along this system from end to end. And hypothetically, I suppose, that would have been possible. The Germans dug in first in order to tighten their grip on the territory they'd conquered and to release troops for a drive into Russia. And of course, their engineers knew what they were doing. The German engineers tended to select crests of ridges and hills that afforded good artillery observation. So as you'll know if you visited any of the Western Front battlefields, repeatedly between 1915 and 1917, the Allies were attacking uphill. It's also no accident that the trenches stabilise in one of the most dense areas of railway network in Europe. This shows you the trench line of 1917, not very different from 1915. But beside it, it stabilises between two great railway networks. The German one running down from the North Sea through Lille. Here's the great trunk railway moving across to Metz with German fortification centre, and then down to the east. The Allies have a trunk railway system running down from Calais and Boulogne, down through Amiens, the great railway junction, towards Paris, and then out another railway's trunk line leads out towards Lorraine and towards the east. So both sides, of course, invest heavily in those railway systems and develop them as the war continues. But what that means is that both sides can shuttle reinforcements laterally, quickly and effectively to points of danger. And they can do it faster than attackers can pick their way forward through no man's land. Particularly as by 1916, attackers are facing something like this. Of course, this is an idealized diagram, but this shows you how, as the trench system becomes more complex and elaborate, by 1916, trenches comprise 3 lines, and each line is 3 rows. There's the front line, the support trench, and the reserve trench. In the front line, there will be machine gun posts, there'll be dugouts, 40 feet deep in the chalk soil of the Somme, for example. Where the water table is high, as it was in Flanders, that was supplemented by concrete pillboxes. By 1917, in the Ypres salient, the Germans have hundreds of concrete pillboxes lying behind the front. Now, behind the reserve trench, is the line of the field guns. So machine guns at the front, field guns at the rear. Now, you need to multiply that by 3. Yeah, and think of a system that's extending back for 5 miles or more with intersecting communication trenches. Taken together, as was shown time and again, the attacking infantry found these obstacles too strong. Now, a precondition for trench warfare, of course, was enormous numbers of men. This is a tremendously labour-intensive system, if you want to look at it in those terms. Typically, 5,000 combatants per mile of front. But, of course, there were plenty of men. The French, German armies, and by 1916 also the British Army, much bigger than in previous wars. Their losses from disease much lower. Remember, right up until the South African War in 1899 to 1902, losses from disease were much higher than they were for combat wounds. In the First World War, on the Western Front, that changes, though not on other fronts. Advances in medicine also mean that most of the wounded would eventually return to combat duty. In the British Army, typically 2/3 or more of the wounded return to combat duty. Behind the lines, the French and British bring in labourers from all over the world in tens of thousands, from China, from Africa, to build railways and move munitions and stores. The Germans use prisoners of war. Both sides, of course, impose unremitting labour duties on the soldiers themselves. As you'll know again if you've looked at the memoirs of this period, what's striking is how much of the time was spent actually doing heavy-duty labouring, bringing stuff up to the front line, digging trenches, laying out barbed wire. But there are enough men to do all that, and there's also enough munitions. Every army, of course, runs into shell shortages in the winter of 14-15, but all of them accomplish production miracles. Certainly by 1916, in general, even in Russia or in Italy, the army's demands for shells are able to be met. And also, they're able to supply the armies all the year round. Another big difference from previous wars is that in winter, troops stay in the front line. They don't retreat to winter barracks or bivouacs. New technologies do not, at first, at any rate, offer a way out. One of the most notorious of the new technologies is poison gas, initiated on the Western Front in 1915, though this picture is actually from April 1918. It shows British troops temporarily blinded, actually. Most of them would recover their sight after the German use of mustard gas in April 1918. Mustard gas is a feature of the later part of the war. To begin with, in 1915, it was mostly chlorine, and it was released from canisters, so it depended on a favourable wind. By 1916, chlorine had given way to phosgene as the standard gas used by the French and Germans, which was 6 times more lethal and was fired in artillery shells. So by the end of the war, the second half, gas is typically delivered in artillery shells. It's a form of artillery. There's an alternative to high explosive. But by 1916 already, both sides had developed reasonably effective gas masks. So what gas warfare does is add another dimension of horror to the fighting. It doesn't actually kill nearly as many people as high explosive and shrapnel did, but it slows everything down even more without giving the attacker an outstanding advantage. And the same can be said about tanks. Here's an early British tank in action, a Mark I tank. In action on the Somme, Battle of the Somme in September 1916. Don't forget also that the French were developing tanks pretty much in parallel to us and first used them in April 1917. But these are still used in very small numbers. The tanks crawl forward at barely more than walking pace. They're extremely vulnerable to mechanical breakdown. Most break down, in fact, before they go into action. Once they do get to the front line, they're very vulnerable to enemy shell fire. And they're only used really before 1918 in dozens, at most, rather than hundreds. So tanks are very much a nascent technology. This means that the most promising technological solution really to trench stalemate is heavy artillery. Roughly, heavy artillery means a caliber of 6 inches or more. This is much more formidable weapon then than the field gun. The French 75mm field gun, which you think about it, is about half that caliber. And the shell will be less than half the weight. The explosive charge will be much less in a field gun than it is in heavy artillery. Heavy artillery is in the end what was going to break the trench stalemate by 1918, particularly when directed by air power. One of the things that enormously develops during the war is aerial reconnaissance. Each side takes tens of thousands of aerial photographs, high-resolution photographs of the other side. And this is the main thing that aircraft do in the war. Before them, tethered balloons, but by 1718, aircraft are mainly used for reconnaissance and photography. They do ground attack, and they also do strategic bombing. German Gotha bombers bombed London, of course, in 1917, 1918, and British bombers bombed the Rhineland. Much less effective than in the Second World War. The primary role of aircraft is in gathering information about where the enemy artillery batteries were located. Once they can do that and communicate the information to the heavy guns, then you have a system that can destroy trench fortifications. But it takes time. It takes a long time to manufacture thousands of heavy guns, which is what is needed, millions of shells, and training hundreds of crews, because operating these things is an extremely skilled task. It's almost like a kind of industrial process. By 1917, this is being done, and it's already starting to make a difference. By 1917, you can see the system beginning to free up. And another change by 1917, particularly pioneered during the Battle of the Somme, actually, in 16, is the introduction of the creeping barrage, which means that when infantry attack an enemy trench, a curtain of fire is laid down that advances before them, ideally, from field guns and from machine guns, which means that they are protected, more or less, until they are on top of their target. The combination of heavy artillery to silence the enemy guns and creeping barrage to silence the enemy machine guns turns out to be a very effective system. But it does take a long time to achieve this. Some historians have argued that the British and French armies are on a so-called learning curve between 1915 and 1917. They're learning how to break through trench defences, and in many ways this is true, I think. But what it omits is, first of all, of course, that the learning curve was extremely slow, it was extremely costly, and also that the German defenders are also on a learning curve, and their defensive tactics have much changed by 1917. By 1917, the Germans typically leave very few troops in the front line, where they're most vulnerable to bombardment. They concentrate most of their infantry in the support trenches further back, with the intention of doing a prompt counterattack once the Allied advance has begun to lose momentum. That's very effective for a while during 1917. Anyway, the point I want to get across here is that what we do not see in the middle period of the war is simply the kind of interminable repetition of an unvarying script. It's not true. There is a rapid change in military technology and tactics, despite the Western Front's static appearance. It doesn't seem to move very much. But underneath all this, there is still a fundamental equilibrium. German army, throughout the middle period of the war, deploys about a third of its strength in the east. So it never has numerical superiority in the West until 1918. The Allies have superior numbers, but they do not have the Germans' military efficiency, and they're trying to attack uphill against German defences in a situation where the defenders have the natural advantage. Now, we need to put what's happening on the Western Front in a broader context, including the war at sea. From 1915 onwards, the Allies are attempting to impose a total blockade, stop all food, medical supplies, everything reaching the Central Powers. But this takes a long time, partly because Germany, as you can see from the map, is able to continue to import from its neutral neighbours, from the Netherlands and from Denmark, both of which, of course, are big agricultural producers and very efficient. It's not until about the middle of the war that the blockade really begins to bite. Another feature of the war, on the other hand, is the Germans are very cautious in using their high seas fleet, which they built up at such expense before the war. Their modern battleship fleet, stationed essentially here in Wilhelmshaven and at Kiel and the Baltic, For most of the war, the High Seas Fleet is deliberately kept in port, avoids the risk of a head-on clash with the British Grand Fleet stationed up here in the Orkneys, because the German government wanted to keep their fleet in being as a means of pressure on the British in an eventual peace conference. Now, there's one exception, which is, of course, the Battle of Jutland on the 31st of May 1916. This is the one moment when the main battleship fleets of the two sides come into within firing range, and they are within firing range of each other for 20 minutes before the German Navy turns away and goes back to port. Now, in the Battle of Jutland, the Germans inflict twice as much damage on the British as the British inflict on the Germans, but the conclusion that the High Seas Fleet Command reaches is that they've had a very narrow escape, and they must not run such risks again, which means from now on, the main German device against the British blockade and Allied blockade will be, of course, the submarine. Now, submarines, like tanks, are very new technology. They predated the war by a bit, but not very much. As of 1914, the Germans have only 27 of them. But by the beginning of 1917, they have well over 100. And it's really not until the winter of 1916-17 that the Germans have enough U-boats to do serious damage to Allied shipping. They're also hobbled, not just by numbers of U-boats, too few, but also by American protests, which they quickly run into, of course, after the notorious sinking of the British liner, the Lusitania, in May 1915, American protests against the way in which the Germans wanted to conduct the submarine war. What the Germans wanted to pursue was unrestricted submarine warfare, which means, in other words, torpedoing without warning anything afloat around the British Isles and northern French waters or in the Mediterranean, be it an Allied ship or a neutral ship, be it a passenger liner or a merchant ship, all to be sunk. Now, the Germans don't adopt unrestricted submarine warfare permanently until February 1917. By then, they think they've got enough U-boats, and they also think that it can prevail quickly enough to starve the British out so that it won't make any difference, even if the Americans come in. Now, that's a key German mistake, to put it mildly, probably their biggest mistake beyond starting the war in the first place. To understand why they did that, you need to look at what's happening in the other theatres of the war, and you need to move up from tactics to strategy. Now, I've talked quite a bit about trenches. It's important to understand that trenches are characteristic not just of France and Flanders, but also of almost every other land theatre of the war. Gallipoli, after Turkey comes in on the German side in November 1914, the French and British and Dominion forces try to break through and capture Constantinople. As we know, that leads to a trench stalemate on the Gallipoli Peninsula. When Italy comes into the war on the Allied side in May 1915, trenches form up here in the Trentino and on the Isonzo River, where the Italians try to break through into Austria-Hungary and again are held. Allied troops are sent to Macedonia, in the autumn of 1915. Another line of trenches forms in the Balkans. And finally, in Poland, during 1915, the Germans and Austrians drive the Russians back out of this Polish bulge here, but then another line of trenches forms in eastern Poland, though on the eastern front it was always more fluid, more mobile than it was in the west, partly because the line is as long, it's about 500 miles, but the size of the army, the line is about 1,000 miles, it's twice as long, but with armies of about the same size, so the density of troops per mile is about half of what it is in the Western Front. But everywhere, every front you look at, the defenders have the tactical advantage. So we need to look at strategy. The big strategic story in 1915, as I just indicated, the Germans and Austrians hold the Western Front with the minimum of forces while they drive east against the Russians, drive them out of Poland, and then the Germans help the Austrians to overrun Serbia down here with assistance from Bulgaria, which comes in September of 1915. So two big waves of German and Austrian advances in the east and in the Balkans, intended, of course, to make the Russians drop out of the war and sign a separate peace, which Tsar Nicholas II refused to do. While all of this is going on, the Allies lack coordination. The French attacking mainly here to try to liberate their territory, Italians down here, British main effort is down here. Yeah? So there's a kind of lack of coordination on the Allied side in 1915, which gives the Central Powers the initiative, and this 15 is a very successful year from them. 1916 is not. In 1916, the pattern changes, and this is because of something called the Chantilly Conference. French High Command headquarters at Chantilly, northern France. In December 1915, the Allies decide to synchronize a number of offensives in the summer of 1916. They'll try to attack simultaneously to subject the Germans and Austrians to a combined squeeze. That's the plan. What happens instead is the Germans preempt them by starting an attack at Verdun in eastern France. It's the Germans who take the initiative in February 1916, and Verdun is the first of the big attrition battles. 1915, the big innovation is trenches. 1916, the innovation is months-long battles of attrition in confined spaces with enormous numbers of casualties running into the hundreds of thousands. Both sides, generals, adopt clear attrition strategies. They will try to win by inflicting huge numbers of casualties on the enemy until they crack. And the Germans start to do this in Verdun with a deliberate plan to inflict the maximum number of casualties by taking over a symbolic area of importance to the French in the hope that the French will exhaust themselves in counterattacks against the German artillery. It's a very bloodthirsty, rather chilling conception, which actually has essentially failed. The battle becomes as damaging for Germany as it does for France, even before summer 1916, when the Chantilly offensives go into effect. The British Battle of the Somme is part of this, or Anglo-French, I should say, Battle of the Somme on the 1st of July, running through to November. But it's actually the Russians who began this. Here's a still, of course, from the documentary, the British documentary film on the Battle of the Somme. This is actually a reconstructed, staged sequence in the film, but almost all of the rest of that film was filmed on the 1st of July 1916. But the Chantilly offensives, the Allied programme of summer offensives, begins with a Russian attack in the east, the Russian so-called Brusilov offensive. The Russians advance, and about half of the Austrian army facing them collapses and is either taken prisoner or becomes casualties. The Germans have to call off the Battle of Verdun in order once again to assist the Austrians. There's a kind of pattern here. Repeatedly, the Germans have to call off operations in the west in order to send troops eastwards to deal with an emergency there. And that's only the beginning, because August 1916, Romania comes into the war. There's also an Italian offensive. The Italians are able at last to make some progress and capture the town of Gorizia. So if you put all this together, the summer of 1916, we tend to think of the Battle of the Somme as a disaster, and of course in many ways from the British perspective it was. But the German leaders were extremely worried about the Battle of the Somme and the pressure their troops were under in the West, especially as they were under pressure simultaneously in Eastern Europe. What happens is there's actually a crisis in Germany and a new team takes over. Paul von Hindenburg on the left, Erich Ludendorff on the right, with Kaiser Wilhelm II there in the middle. This is the new team that takes over the German Army High Command. They change the tactics. They do manage to stabilize the situation by overrunning Romania, halting the Russians, and holding the Allied advance on the Somme to 6 miles. But what they're afraid of is that in spring 1917, the Allies will do the same thing again. There'll be another synchronized offensive. And as a result of that, that's the context in which the German army decides to back the German Navy's rather desperate plan for unrestricted submarine warfare intended to starve the British out in 5 months. The Germans know that's virtually certain to bring America into the war, but they calculate that the chances of breaking the British and making the Allies surrender are so good that the Americans' entry will make no difference or no substantial difference. It's a catastrophic miscalculation. Now, of course, on the Allied side, the Allies were intending to carry on with synchronized offensives in the spring of 1917. The key reason why they don't is because of the Russian Revolution. Here's one of the last pictures we have of Tsar Nicholas II, looking rather melancholy, of course, under guard after he had abdicated and the provisional government had come to power in Russia to replace him. But that revolution in Russia meant the Russians could no longer cooperate in the Allied combined offensives. And what happens in 1917 is you move back to a position of rather uncoordinated Allied attacks. The French attack in April, the so-called Nivelle offensive, complete failure. very quickly leads on to mutinies in the French army, which cripple it, make it impossible to carry out further major offences for several months. The British decide, in spite of the Russian Revolution and the French mutinies, partly actually because of them, to persist with the Third Battle of Ypres. This is a scene from September, I think, of 1917, Chateau Wood outside Ypres. Between July and November, the British are attacking in Belgium with the aim of breaking the trunk railway behind the German lines and capturing the ports of Ostend and Zeebrugge, which were German U-boat bases. So Passchendaele, as it becomes this battle, is intended partly to deal with the German submarine menace, though the real reason behind it is Sir Douglas Haig, the British commander, believed that he could single-handedly defeat the German army. He was extraordinarily overconfident. Even with the Americans not coming in, the British thought, for perhaps another 18 months, even with the French largely out of the picture, the British were extremely confident, partly because of the tactical changes that I've talked about, that they had the capacity to defeat the Germans. There was a bitter debate in London between the politicians and the military about this, but in the end, the politicians under Lloyd George as Prime Minister give the go-ahead for the battle to proceed. The battle arguably damages the British army more than it does the German one. So, by the end of 1917, despite America's entry into the war, America came in April, what America does is to keep the Allies going with financial help, economic help, naval help, psychological help, perhaps most important of all. But the Allies still, at the end of 1917, seem no nearer to solving the fundamental problem of how to expel the Germans from France and Belgium without ruinous cost in lives and in expenditure. Now, when we move into 1918 and the third and final phase of the war, the Western Front map looks very different. Remember how static it was between 1915 and 1917. This is how it looks between March and July of 1918, when there are 5 great German offensives, so-called Ludendorff offensives. Twice the Germans advance nearly 50 miles. They threaten key British railway junctions at Amiens and at Hazebrouck. They get halfway to Paris. That's between March and July of 1918. Between July and November, the Allies first recapture the territory lost. This shows the front line as it is as late September 1918, when the Allies launch a series of coordinated offensives, and by 11th of November, the Armistice Day, they've got to this line here. They've pushed the Germans out of France almost altogether, and they've overrun the western part of Belgium, and that's the point where the ceasefire happens. So both sides have learned to break through trenches, not just the Allies, but also the Germans. And if you look at photographs of the 1918 fighting, much of it is not actually in trenches. Much of it is in foxholes and in open fields even, as during the Second World War, a lot of it looks like, rather than what we think of as the Somme or the Third Ypres. The Allied advance, if slower, is more sustained and it goes further. So what lies behind this? The Russian Revolution, the Second Russian Revolution. Remember, the first revolution is the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II. The second is Lenin and the Bolsheviks seizing power in November 1917. October by the old Russian calendar, followed by a ceasefire which enables the Germans to move about 500,000 men from the east to the west. So the Germans regain a numerical majority on the Western Front, and they have an incentive to use it quickly before the Americans arrive in strength, because remember, as of March 1918, there are still only 250,000 American combat personnel in France, in Europe. Ludendorff and Hindenburg know this operation is a gamble, but they believe it worth trying, partly because of new artillery and infantry tactics, what I've been talking about already, but has taken a stage further. By 1918, what the Germans know how to do is to be able to, they can work on calculating the trajectory of each gun in trials behind the lines, so they no longer need to do ranging shots. So they can start an artillery bombardment without any warning, by surprise, without prior preparation, as long as they move the guns up secretly and concealed by night, which they have some success in being able to do. They also use enormous numbers of gas shells, which they direct against the Allied artillery to silence it, and a creeping barrage, there's Ludendorff, the architect of much of this, to support assaults by the German stormtroops. These show German stormtroops actually in Italy, where they broke through Italian lines at the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917. But the principle on the Western Front then is not attacks in mass waves, but small squads, specialists equipped with portable machine guns, grenades and flamethrowers who will bypass the opposing strong points and drive on as far and fast as possible. Supported by aircraft. Aircraft do ground attack, they do some strafing. What the Germans do not have are tanks, except a few British ones, and they all captured British ones, and they also have very few lorries, only about a tenth of those possessed by the Allies. They are very seriously suffering from petrol and from rubber shortages, and they're also desperately short of horses, tens of thousands of whom died in 1917-18 on the German side because they didn't have the vets to look after them. Most of them died of mange and also of starvation and shortage of fodder. So supply shortages, which had hobbled the Germans in 1914 in mobile warfare, hobble them again in 1918. They can break through Allied trenches, but again and again those advances that I showed on the first map there run out of steam and impetus because of lack of logistical backup. And while the Germans are doing these offensives, their army loses about 1 million casualties, which they cannot replace. Whereas on the other hand, the Americans step up their troop shipments much faster to what they previously planned in response to this emergency. The numbers of Americans in France go up from 250,000 in March 1918 to 2 million by November of 1918, when they actually outnumber the British. Here's a rare picture of an American troop convoy heading towards France in 1918. Up to 250,000 Americans cross each month in the summer of 1918. So the numerical advantage swings back in the Allies' favour. The Allies also have tactical advantages. They too know how to use heavy artillery to break through trenches supported by aerial reconnaissance, and they have the advantage of superior logistics. This shows a British locomotive on the Western Front in 1918. The French railway system, like the German railway system, is wearing down by 1918 due to years of neglect. But the British and Americans supply tens of thousands of locomotives, rolling stock, and railway personnel which keep the system running. And what the Allies also have is tens of thousands of lorries fueled with American petrol. They also now have hundreds of tanks. Here's a British Mark IV tank. Remember the previous one I showed you was a Mark I. These are generally not used, however, in mass. They're generally used in relatively small numbers for infantry support. So they're a kind of ancillary thing, but remember the Germans don't have them, and the tanks are very useful in helping the Allies gain and maintain surprise. Finally, the Allies have a supreme commander, Ferdinand Foch, again appointed in response to the emergency of March 1918, given coordination power over the Allied forces, and he devises a combined strategy. I've shown you this map before, but the essence of the strategy is, number one, clear the Germans away from the Allied trunk railways. Number two, break through the German trunk railway, which you can see here in green behind the German line, paralyze the German system of reinforcement and logistics. And at the end of September 1918, the bulk of the German reinforcements and reserves are here, envisaging an Allied attack in Lorraine. When the Allies attack further north and in the centre, the German reinforcement system breaks down. And it is actually on the 28th of September that Hindenburg and Ludendorff decide that Germany must seek an armistice. The other reason why they decide that is because of news down in the Balkans, and these things happen simultaneously. Mid-September, Allied forces on the Balkan front break through up the Vardar Valley into Serbia. Bulgaria surrenders. This means that Allied forces can separate off Austria-Hungary and Germany on the one hand from Turkey on the other, and in addition, they can get into Romania. Round Ploesti here was the main German source of oil. That's now threatened, and the Germans know it. So the Balkans and the Western Front, those two situations crack simultaneously. The Allies in the autumn of 1918 are also attacking in the south, advancing into Syria, and the Italians break through the Austrian defences here, and 400,000 Austrian troops surrender at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. Austria-Hungary disintegrates as a political enemy. Now, before I stop, this Allied advantage on tactics and technology rests, of course, on enormous achievements in munitions production. Most of it in Britain and France. These are the big producers of weapons and explosives in the First World War. The Americans provide steel, and they provide oil, and they provide money and loans. But America is not the manufacturing heartland that it was going to be in the Second World War. American contribution is indispensable, but the British and French are actually the manufacturing hubs. The second precondition is command of the seas. The main reason why the U-boats are defeated, though not the only one, is the introduction of the convoy system in 1917. Another thing, almost equally important, is the Allies use their surviving ships more efficiently by turning them around faster in the ports and concentrating them on the North Atlantic run. So although they've lost an awful lot of ships to German submarines, the amount of goods being landed in British ports in 1918 is actually higher than it had been in 1916. So munitions achievement, manufacturing, but also maritime seaborne supply. These things are crucial. In many ways, the Allied victory is a victory for superior organisation and also of leadership. Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George, Georges Clemenceau, Vittorio Orlando provide effective leadership in what's become, by 1918, a contest between autocracies and democracies. Final. This is a chart showing German surrenders monthly to the British Army on the Western Front. And what you see is how it leaps up after August 1918. Now, I want to underline this. Yeah? This is no longer the same army as it had been in 1916 and 1917. The German morale is crumbling from within. Very large numbers surrendering, very large numbers deserting. The German ordinary troops and their junior officers know the war is lost. They know it before the High Command decides to surrender at the end of September. So I want to stress, really, coming back to sort of the great debate about the First World War, yes, the Allies are more effective. And the British, French and Americans all become more effective. And all three of those groupings, I should say British Empire, American, France, all three of those make indispensable contributions to the victory. But the victory comes in 1918 not just because of Allied strengths, but also because of German mistakes. Number one, the submarine offensive, which brings in the Americans. Number two, the Ludendorff offensive, offensives which do terrible damage to the German army once the Germans go out onto the attack. Nonetheless, there has been a military revolution by 1918. Army officers today in the British Army, and I did a recent discussion with them, they can recognise what armies are doing in 1914. Combined operations of tanks, aircraft and infantry and artillery. Very different from 1914. So there's the armistice. And there I will stop. Thank you.